We are going live, and I guess we are on. Okay, so hopefully if somebody's out there, they will announce themselves or we'll see them arrive. This is Beau and Kathy, and we're going to talk about our father and husband and things like that. And so anyway, we are just waiting to see that everything is okay. This is not the screen I'm really used to seeing. So I'm going to call Paul. And I'm going to verify. It looks like somebody showed up. Aha! Somebody's there. No, Jim, Louie's not here. This is Beau and Kathy. But we're good, I guess. So you know we're on. Can you see us? Very good. All right, terrific. All right, we are on. This is Beau L'Amour, and I'm here with my mother, Catherine L'Amour. And hey, Les, it's good to see you, hear from you, whatever it is. And let me see, we've got all these people coming in. Yeah. And so we're going to wait till a couple more people show up, but this is great. Thank you for coming this evening. I'm at my mother's house, and we're going to tell you a little bit about her life and life with Louie and things of that sort. And okay, so it seems like we're doing good here. Terrific. All right. So anyway, I am Beau L'Amour. This is Catherine L'Amour, my mother, and we're going to talk a little bit about Dad, and we're going to go till about 6:30, and then we're going to take your questions. So if you have questions, hang on to them, and we will get around to them and after 6:30. And if there's anything left over, I will dodge back onto Facebook and try and circle around and answer your questions and everything. See, we've got a bunch of Australians. That's terrific. Good day. All right. So my mother is going to tell you a little bit about her background and then how she came to meet Dad and things of that sort. So why don't you start off with, tell us where you were born and how you grew up and things like that, and I'll just prompt you if I think you need it.
I probably will.
Okay. Very good.
I am a Southern California girl, born and raised here, and lived almost all of my life here. Grew up in Los Angeles and in the San Fernando Valley, and some down at La Quinta.
So where's La Quinta is near Palm Springs, and that is in the Coachella Valley of the Southern California low desert.
Right. So I've spent all my time in this part of the world, and I met Louie when I was just out of college, and he was dating a girl that I knew, and that's how I met him. And we had many, many evenings together as we double dated a lot. And he came to our ranch down in the Palms at La Quinta, and he then left and went to New York for a while. And when he came back, I ran into him again, and he was no longer dating my friend. And so he asked me out, and that's how our love affair began. So it was kind of meant to be, I think, because I was driving down Sunset Boulevard on the way home from an interview, and I saw Louie at a newspaper machine, getting a newspaper out of a machine in front of the old Garden of Allah, which was a famous hotel in the early Hollywood days. And I pulled over to the curb. In those days, you could pull over to the curb on Sunset Boulevard. And I said, "Hi, Louie." And he turned around, he looked at me. He said, "I've been looking everywhere for you." I couldn't believe it. I thought, wow, what a line. anyway, it was the truth. He didn't know how to find me, and he didn't know what to do. I had an unlisted phone number, and so it was pretty much impossible to contact me. So we happened to run into each other on the street that day, and that began our courtship and later marriage, and that's how it all began. Sunset Boulevard, close to Crescent Heights, in front of the Garden of Allah. That was the magic place.
So tell people a bit about growing up. Your father, what did he do for a living?
Oh, my dad was a developer.
So what does that mean?
That means you go into an area where there are not, it's not well populated, but develop it as a resort or a weekend place. He developed Big Bear up in the San Bernardino Mountains, and
so what is that?
That means
you're talking to people all around the world.
Well,
okay.
That means you have to put in the roads and the electricity and the water lines and the gas lines and subdivide the area, and then you have to sell property. And he built a beautiful big clubhouse and sold memberships in the club, so people could go for the weekend to their mountain home and enjoy the evening festivities in the clubhouse and have their own homes there and spend their free time up in the mountains of Southern California.
So Big Bear is about 2 hours east of Los Angeles, and it's relatively high up in the mountains. There is skiing there, and there's a nice big lake where you can swim and water ski and do various things like that. So this was a resort area in the mountains.
Oh yeah, they had a heated, in the early days in Hollywood in the 20s, they had a heated pool, they had movies, a movie theater, they had a wonderful restaurant. It was quite a lovely place, the clubhouse. Right. And people built their own homes and belonged to the club. And so that development went on for quite a few years, and then my dad moved down to the La Quinta area, which is south of Palm Springs, and developed that whole little valley, put in them again, the roads, the electricity, all the things you need to live. And people bought property there and built their own homes. And we had a little ranch there. We grew grapefruit and dates, and we had our horses there. And that was our place to go through the winter time until we were ready for school. Then we couldn't go as much. But when we were really young, my brothers and I spent a lot of time down there. And then after that, my dad bought more land in the San Fernando Valley and built a home. And we moved there and lived out there for the next few years. And then eventually we moved back into Los Angeles and finished up our growing up in high school and college time living in LA.
And so the La Quinta property, which my mom's family owned into my childhood. So I don't know that it lasted until I was 12, but it probably lasted until I was 8. And so mom and dad spent a lot of time down there. And that's actually the place where dad began to get his inspiration to write The Lonesome Gods. So those are kind of the locations. The La Quinta area, Palm Springs area, are sort of the locations of the Lonesome Gods. And then tell us a little bit about your mother. So she came out. Just tell us about how she came out here and what she did.
My mother was an actress in silent films. She came to Hollywood in 1923 or 4. She was very young, and she was very beautiful. And she worked a lot in pictures. She did a lot of B westerns, which were not the top of the line, but she worked a lot. And she became a Wampus Baby star, which meant she was looked at as a star of the future. When she met my father, she put her career on hold. She didn't want to go on with it anymore. And they got married and raised a family, and she became his wife and his advocate, and that changed her life completely. So California, though, became the home for all of us because of that, because she was here and he was here. My dad was on the way to China when he discovered Big Bear. He was going to work for Shell Oil, and he went to the mountains to spend a couple of days with a sleeping bag, and he fell in love with it.
Let's back up a little bit. So your dad was in the oil business, correct?
Well, he worked in the oil fields down in Texas. I wouldn't say he was in the oil business.
Well, that's when you're drilling for oil. That's what you're doing.
That's what he was doing. Yes, it was.
And so he did that for quite a few years, and then he was on his way to South China to do the same thing there. And because in those days you had, ships didn't leave every week. You had, I don't know if it was one ship a month or one ship every couple of months. When he came out to Southern California to get his ride to China, he had some time on his hands.
That's right.
And he went camping in the mountains in the Big Bear area.
Yeah, he loved the mountains.
Suddenly decided he wanted to change careers.
Yeah,
and
he fell in love with it.
Stay in the United States.
And he didn't have a lot of money, but somehow he did it.
Right. And your mother was from Hot Springs, Arkansas.
Yeah.
And
she was a Southern girl.
Right. And so, okay, so that's sort of a beginning. And so you and Dad got married, and why don't you, occasionally you guys would go out and do, or actually quite often in the summertime, you guys would go off and do these big road trips. So my father did not drive. So my mother was his chauffeur and research assistant and everything,
secretary,
everything else.
Cook.
Yeah. So they went to tell us a little bit about some of the trips that you guys took in the early days in the late 50s, before I was born.
Our trips were all by car. And we traveled through the Southwest. I used to say I thought I'd been on every dirt road in Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico. We were back and forth across that area many, many, many times. And we always put a typewriter in the trunk of the car and prayed that the trunk didn't leak so that the dust wouldn't get on the keys and Louis would have trouble working. And then we'd just take off and we'd be gone for maybe 4 to 6 weeks, and he'd do research and I'd drive, and we'd interview people. We always interviewed the old timers in the areas where we were, and many times they were people who had still been around when some of the early characters out of the West were still around, and we had a great time. It was fabulous, and it was before we had any children, so we were free to come and go as we wanted. And we did that for the first 5 years of our marriage. And it was rich, it was great. And sometimes it was a long drive and I would get a little tired, but it was okay. It was okay. And Louis loved it and he benefited tremendously from it. Up until that time, he really hadn't had a car or the ability to go anywhere except by hitchhiking or walking or getting in a boxcar, on a train, all the ways he traveled in the early days were before me. We did not travel that way. We did travel by car. I did not have to learn how to jump on a train or jump off. That was good.
So it seems like there's a lot of comments. So maybe I'll just go back through here and see if there are any questions. I'll probably miss some, so
I can.
I'm just quickly looking for question marks. If I miss some, I will. I will miss. If I miss some, I'll come back and try and get them later on. Oh, and Paul just posted the official Big Bear Lake official travel and tourism website. That's great. I'm so glad he's doing that. And he also posted a link for La Quinta so that you can see it. Now, Big Bear is a lot more crowded, but it's fundamentally the same. La Quinta is not so much the same. La Quinta is definitely built up in a different place since my mom's family lived down there. Um, and so I would say if you've got some questions, begin thinking about what they are and sort of throwing them in there.
What are these, just comments?
A lot of them are comments and thank yous and things like that.
Nice.
So once once my sister and I were born, and or even before that, one of the things that I'm trying to think of all the different things that you would do. You were often the first proofreader
Oh,
of
always,
a book.
always was the first person to
And,
read the manuscript and go through as a copy editor, not as an editor.
Right. And then you kind of took care of all of Dad's social business and things like that. My mother's friends used to call her the general because she was so good at organizing organizing everything.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
I think it's complimentary. It may not be exactly the kind of compliment that you want, but I think it's definitely complimentary. And so I'm just looking through some things here, and I just located a question from Jared Ham. Are there any unreleased works that could possibly be released at some point? You guys have seen, I mean, almost everything that could come out has come out in one form or another. The Lost Treasures program really covered a lot of the last few things. I mean, we have some scripts and manuscripts and stuff that we have kind of stuck away in the files, but there are things that I don't think we own. So when I go through things, I have to be very careful to make sure that it's something that was actually ours.
Well, they were things he wrote,
yeah,
but maybe under someone else's.
So sometimes I answer. There are some duplicate questions coming up here that I have answered in the past, but I think people will be really interested in your answer to these things. So Jonathan Jackson says, "What must bedtime have been like for the kids? I can't imagine him telling a short story. Did story time go on long?" So,
okay.
What do you think?
Well, when the children were small, Louis would read to them at the breakfast table. Many times it was something they were interested in, but many times it was something he was interested in. You know, like the history of technology. They just listened. They loved to hear him read. I read all the children books to them. So they never went to bed without a story. That was part of our story always every night before they went to bed, sometimes 2, sometimes they'd beg for 3. But Louis' reading to them was more in the morning at the breakfast table, or when we were on trips, he would read in the car to them. That was really fun because he read to us. He read books that I enjoyed. I'm driving, so I'm not able to read in the car. So he would read to us things that I had missed growing up. And it was fabulous. It was great. We couldn't wait to get in the car in the morning. And so he entertained us with great, great, great stories and things that the 3 of us will never forget.
It's kind of interesting that we went into audiobooks very early because Dad was sort of the living audiobook for a long time in our family.
Absolutely.
Okay. Here's another. What was Louis' favorite book that he wrote? This is Robert Kubenbender that asks this. So
I think it was always the one he was working on. I think it was hard for him to ever say one of them over the other. The one he was working on was usually the one he was most enthusiastic about at the moment. And his energy was what kept him going. And I think what people see in his writing anyway. So it was always whatever was the current book or the one that was just coming up from behind.
You mean the one he hadn't quite written yet?
He hadn't quite written, but he couldn't wait to start it.
Exactly.
So it was in the hopper, ready to come.
Adrian Jancy asks, how did he switch gears to do I think so well with the non-Western stories such as The Walking Drum?
Well, he wrote The Walking Drum quite early in his career, and had a problem getting it published. His publisher did not want him to be writing fiction, historical fiction, and he wanted.
They just wanted Western.
They just wanted Western historical fiction. They did not want something for the 12th century. So The Walking Drum laid in a closet. They sent it back, and it laid in a closet for years, until one night at dinner, I mentioned it to the CEO of Bantam, and I said, if you like historicals, you should really read Louis's book, The Walking Drum. It's fabulous. And the guy just practically climbed across the table at us. He said, you've got a historical novel? And Louis said, sure, yeah. And so we sent it to him, and he read it, and the story changed, and Bantam published it, and it went on to become a New York Times bestseller and sold enormously well. And that broke the ice for Louis to write other things, which is what he really truly wanted to do. He loved writing the Westerns. He loved the story of our country. He loved the story of the people who settled this country, but he also loved a lot of other things. And I think a truly creative person you can't keep them in one spot. You can't do that to them, whether it's a painter or a sculptor or a songwriter or a composer or whatever. They have to branch out. There's something in their DNA that makes them reach for other things. And Louis finally was able to do that. And he always wrote Westerns clear up until the end. The last book he wrote, which was only half finished, was a Western.
One of the major elements of the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures series is the difficulty that Dad had. He never wanted to stop writing Westerns, but he wanted to write other things. And so a lot of it has to do with the difficulty that he had moving into other genres. And The Walking Drum is a very big part of that. So The Walking Drum was originally written in 1960, wasn't published until 1984. And a lot of the story that you see coming out sort of between the lines, if you read the Lost Treasures postscripts that are in the old novels, or if you read the two books, Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures, volumes 1 and 2, is the struggle that Dad had to be able to sell things like The Walking Drum, and how long it took for him to get to the point where he could. So here's someone who probably wasn't here right at the beginning, David O'Callaghan. He says, how did you meet Louis? Do you want to tell that story in a little more detail?
You want it again?
Well, only if it can be a little more detailed.
How did I meet Louis?
Yeah.
I met Louis because I was in an acting class,
right,
with a girl who was in the acting class, and she was dating Louis, and we became friends, and we double dated.
Meaning you and
me and the girl became good friends, and we double dated. So Louis came into my life and into my family's life, and was a big presence for about a year or so. And then he went back east, and he was gone for a while, and I didn't really know what had happened to him. I used to write to her occasionally, and she'd mention him or not. Anyway, one day I'm driving down Sunset Boulevard, and there's Louis standing buying a newspaper in front of the old Garden of Allah, which was a famous hotel. A lot of Eastern big writers would stay there when they'd come to Hollywood to work in the film industry. And I pulled over to the curb and said, "Hi, Louis, I gave him my name. I didn't even know if he'd remember me." And he turned around and looked at me, and he said, "I've been looking everywhere for you." And I just, I thought that was great. And then we started to date. He asked me out. He had long since broken up with her. And in a year or so, we were married.
James Larkin Smith says, how many of his books started off as bedtime stories to you? Now, I'm not sure which one of us that's aimed at, okay?
You probably.
But I would say Dad didn't talk all that much about what he was writing. He was always nervous that he would become what he called talked out. And that means he would get to know the story so well that it would not interest him as much. And so it's actually one of the interesting things about the material that's in Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volumes 1 and 2 is there's a number of treatments in there. A treatment is the description of a story. It sometimes can be quite in depth. It sometimes could be 40 pages or more that a writer will do, and then they'll send it to a publisher or a movie company or something like that, and they'll say, here, look at this. Pay me to write a story that's like this. And it was often the case that once Louis had done a treatment, he lost interest in the story because he kind of knew what happened. And at that point, he wasn't so interested. And he was very aware that he had that problem. So he didn't really talk all that much about what he was writing. Now I'm trying to scroll here, and I'm kind of locked in my scrolling. Let's see here. Phyllis Page says, my husband reads all his books and would like to have an autographed picture. Are they available anywhere? Not really. There might be a few you could find occasionally on eBay, but we certainly don't have a drawer full of them or anything like that. So let's see what else is here. So Jim Tomlin said, did you ever accompany Louis when he was walking over the terrain while researching a book? So I would say many times,
Oh, yeah.
many times.
We were there a lot with him. Our children traveled with us in the summer once they were old enough to go. So they were like 2 and 5 probably by the time we started dragging them around. Beau went a little bit before Angelique was born, but not on any big long trips. But eventually they went on a lot of long trips, and we walked the land that Louis was writing about. We weren't always exactly sure what book it was going into.
Exactly. I don't think
we were there, and he wasn't either, but he had a need to see it and feel it and get familiar with it. So we went to many, many, many sites that took place in his books.
There's probably a better answer to that in the Lost Treasures postscript to Shalako and Callaghan. So the Lost Treasures postscript to Shalako, part of that describes a trip that Mom and Dad took in the late 50s that covered some of the locations for Shalako. It also covered some of the locations for the Daybreakers, and it was kind of a trip where they wandered around New Mexico quite a bit. And then if you look at the Lost Treasures postscript for Callaghan, the Callaghan postscript is right out of Dad's journal, and it's a fairly in-depth description of everywhere we went, looking for the locations of the army forts on the Mojave Desert Road and things like that. That was in the early 1970s. And so those are pretty good. I mean, I don't think either one of us could do as much justice as those postscripts would to answer that question. I'm kind of skipping. Unfortunately, what's happening is the feed here kind of jumps around a little bit as I scroll, and so I may be taking some things out of order, and we're just going to have to live with that. So Shayna Matthews says, my question, how long did it take him to write most of his Westerns? How extensive was his research? So you want to answer that, and I can pitch in some?
Well, I think every book took a different length of time. As Louis used to say, it takes as long as it takes. You can't pin it down to X number of hours or days or weeks. He worked pretty fast. He wrote a lot. He wrote 5 to 10 pages every day of his life. So that was one way that he was able to accomplish what he did. But sometimes the book would get started a second or a third time, and it would take a lot longer than it would have taken had he continued with that first beginning of it. So there's no way to judge that, really. And I don't think he tried to.
Yeah, I would say the real question is so you could say, if you counted back from the last day that he was writing, from the day that he finished writing, a lot of times you could go back about 3 or 4 months and find the moment where he had started writing full time on that story. But that doesn't mean he didn't work part time on it before that, and maybe on and off for many, many years. And so, you could say, well, a lot of times it took 90 to 100 days to write a story, but it really wasn't that simple, because the moment where he actually started was kind of nebulous. So sorry, a lot of times he started and then he put it down. He would put it down sometimes for years.
Yeah, write another book, then go back to it.
And then the other question was, how extensive was his research? So Dad did a lot of research, but it's important to know that it was mostly for inspiration. So sometimes he would go and he would check a particular detail, but he wasn't somebody that went through and checked, every single detail as he wrote. He had a very good memory, and he was constantly doing research to kind of keep himself, able to project himself into kind of a different time or place or something of the sort. But it wasn't sort of scholarly research. And so let's see here. Like I said, I'm forced to kind of skip around a little bit because my feed is erratic. And I'll try and catch up with everybody if I can. But let's see what else is here. We're getting some very nice comments, but I'm missing questions. Okay, are there any plans to use any more of his books for a movie? Well, we don't really make plans, unfortunately. If we could make plans to turn them into movies, we would just make plans to turn them all into movies, and they would all be movies, and we'd have a lot of money, and we'd be very happy. So it's not really up to us. I wish it was. It depends on whether or not someone wants a book or not. And so this is Mark Warren, who was asking that comment about movies. So there has to be somebody in the film and television business that wants a film, and then they come to us and they decide whether or not they want something. It hasn't happened very often recently. One of the reasons for that is a lot of Dad's films, maybe the last 15 or 20 years of films, so there isn't that many movies, but the films that were made across the last 15 or 20 years when there were films being made, so up until about 2001, so reaching back into the 70s, a lot of the films were TV movies, and TV movies don't exist anymore, except maybe on the Lifetime or something like that. And so what has replaced them almost everywhere is a TV series. And there's a lot fewer series, because of course they're on every week, than there were movies of the week. So there aren't as many opportunities. And the people who create them generally are very happy to get all of the money themselves. And so it's sort of like if someone says, oh, we really want a Western, then this top executive producer, who's the top writer, will just kind of go out and create something on their own. They usually don't go hunting up an underlying work like something of Dad's to base it on. And then they're completely in control of it, and they get all of that money. And so I'm sure it will happen, but it isn't happening at the moment, and it's nothing you can really count on. I wish it was. Let's see. What else have we got here? Is it your intention to publish Lost Treasures for all his books? No, it isn't. I wish it was, but I don't. The Lost Treasures postscripts are a sort of an article that I've been putting in the back of as many of Dad's books as possible, and they are kind of the story behind the story. And they are, I'm doing as many of them as I can, but if I don't know something, I'm not going to put it in there. And if I have so little material that it would be kind of a ripoff for a fan to buy it. I mean, there's plenty of times I will see something and I'll have, maybe a couple of paragraphs of information about that story. But my rule is sort of, if I can't get several pages out of it at the very least, if not, I like to do them when they're 15, 20 pages long, or maybe more than that. But if there's not enough material, I won't do it, because I don't want anybody to ever pick one up and look at the Lost Treasures thing and go, oh, that wasn't worth it. I bought a whole new book just for this. So some of the shorter stuff I may eventually put on the website, the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures website. And in fact, there already is some of the shorter stuff on the Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures website. Let's see if there's anything else in here, particularly for my mom.
Those aren't questions.
No, some of these are just very nice, very nice comments.
Yeah.
And so if the comments require an answer, I'll try and go back to them. But for the moment, I'm kind of scanning for question marks. Okay, so Les Freeman says, Louis always wrote of a woman to walk beside him on his research and hiking expeditions. How fast did you have to move to stay beside him?
Pretty fast.
It was difficult.
I always said Louis had to marry someone a lot younger. Otherwise, they could never have kept up with him. We all had trouble keeping up with him. Yeah.
He didn't. It wasn't that he moved so quickly, but he didn't like to stop.
Wait.
He did not like to stop or wait for anything.
No.
Stephen Reed says, are there any unpublished stories that he never published? So no, not really. We've kind of gotten to almost everything. So yeah, we're getting to it. Let's see what else we've got here. Who was Dad's favorite author?
Oh, there were lots of them.
Yeah, I don't know that there'd be one, but
there were a lot. Well, Anthony Trollope was a big favorite of his. Well, that's a question.
Dad didn't read a lot of fiction.
Fiction, no.
He tended to read fiction when he was on trips, and sometimes just stuff he'd pick up in the airport. And when he did, because he didn't want to be influenced by somebody writing in a genre similar to the ones that he wrote in, he tended to read, this is just the weirdest thing, but he tended to read a lot of kind of what they used to call armchair mysteries, which might even be called cozy mysteries these days. And so he read Agatha Christie and Ruth Rendell and stuff like that. And a lot of it was just because he was looking for something that was just different from what he did. And then
he'd read all the great writers.
He read all the great writers.
Gosh. Yeah. He kept a list of books that he read every year, and of nonfiction books, it was always at least 100, plus all the fiction that he read. So he read an enormous amount. There was never a time in his life when he wasn't reading 2 or 3 or 4 books at a time. And he kept lists of them, and they're in the back of.
No, the lists are every one of them on the Lost Treasures website.
On the website, of the things he read. So he read philosophy and psychology and science and history and romance, and he read everything.
All right, let's see here. Scanning. Hang on. Stephen Burkett says, have you had any luck finding out more about his vagabond days, the people he knew, and his experiences? I'm always sort of tracking stuff down, but I've got a pretty good idea what was going on when now. So I would say research on that is fairly buttoned up. I like to think about the Lost Treasures program as being the beginning. It's a strange way of doing it, but it's the beginning of a biography. So I had a lot of biographical material on my dad that was on his business and how he did his work. And I didn't really know how to fit that into a traditional biography, but I really knew that it was important, and those were things that I wanted to tell and stories that I wanted to tell. And I was always kind of flummoxed by how I was going to fit that in and how to make all that work together. And so Lost Treasures is an opportunity to let me get all of that out of the way, put all of the business oriented stuff um, into a particular program. So Lost Treasures is kind of like the Louis L'Amour business biography or writing biography, and then the other part of his story will be more personal. Um, and so let's see what else we have here. What's a favorite traveling memory for each of you? You only get one.
Oh gosh, favorite travel.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead with
I
mine.
can't.
We used to travel with our pet beagle, who was a very very wired up dog, and she she knew the word cattle, and if you said cattle, she would immediately go on guard and rush around the inside of the car barking frantically, even if there were no cattle. And so occasionally when my sister and I would get bored while we were in the car, we would call out the dog's name and we would go, cattle, cattle. And then the dog would just go berserk and just sort of charge all over the car, barking furiously. And so that doesn't have to do much with my dad, except that he didn't have a real even temper when we did that. He was not
It was
happy.
like being in a madhouse.
It was crazy.
All subjected to it.
Right.
Me especially, because I was behind the wheel.
Yeah.
Well, that I wouldn't say that was the most favorite. I think the most favorite part, perhaps, was when I went with Louis to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of autographings. And when we would arrive at an autographing, there would be a line around the block, around 2 or 3 blocks, so many people, and they were there so early to be sure they got their books autographed. And many times we would have to put a sign on the back of someone way, way, way down the line that the line ends here, or it would have gone on all day. So I think that was some of the most exciting part of seeing his popularity. And then the fact that everybody could stop and talk to him, and he'd have something nice to say to them, and they'd ask him a question and he'd have an answer, or he knew somebody they knew. It was amazing. And it was very, very rewarding, both to him and to me, to see how people really, really responded to him personally. And a writer works at home and nobody knows what he's doing, and he never really knows if he's any good or anything, except that he sells books. But when you're out there and meet your public and they tell you how much it means, and they tell you things like, this got me through the toughest part of my life, this helped me when I was in the service. He had a lot of servicemen who were big fans, who carried his books all over Southeast Asia, everywhere. So I think those things were really meaningful, because those people would show up at autographings, and it was wonderful to see.
All right, so let's see here. Like I said, I'm kind of having problems skipping around here, so I may have to go back in and answer some of these questions. I guess I'm not really sure what. Facebook constantly changes the way this thing works, and so the comments used to run a little more smoothly than they do now. Was Dad so Joel Anderson asks, was he influenced by Jack London?
Well, I think he outdid Jack London as far as his life was concerned.
Yeah, no, I think he was influenced by Jack London.
Definitely was influenced by him. And Louis was beginning to write at this time when London was also writing, was he not? Yeah, and they both had these very rough.
Jack London probably was not writing after Louis was born.
Oh, he was all before the.
In the earlier era. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well,
I don't know that he was writing up into the 20s, and I forget when he died, but he wasn't very old.
Oh no,
He didn't live into
long.
his 50s.
Oh no, he was 40, I think,
Yeah.
or 38 or something.
Yeah.
But his life was adventurous, and so was Louis. Although Louis used to say that adventure was just another word for trouble.
Adventure is a romantic word for trouble.
Yeah. So he had many
adventures.
Yeah, and more so than Jack London. But Jack London was famous for that.
Yeah.
You know.
So let's see here. We have Caleb Nicholson says, Beau, it just jumped again and I've almost lost it. Beau, what is your favorite book of your father's? I don't know. I've always liked Fallon, but I mean, it's just because it's written in such a fun style. It's a very lighthearted book and it's written in a very lighthearted style. And I've always liked that. And I like the fact that it's kind of different in that way. And then who is your dad's favorite actor all around, and who is the favorite that did his characters? So do you have any feelings about that?
Well, he loved having John Wayne do Hondo, you know. But he loved Tom Selleck and Sam Elliott, and they certainly did the Sacketts, and that was a favorite story of his. There were a lot of people a lot of actors that he liked and admired, and some who worked in his films and some that never did. But it didn't stop him from being a fan.
So again, it's kind of jumping around and I'm sure I'm missing things. Michael Shane Dunbar says, I would love to hear about his inspiration for Haunted Mesa. Well, I'm not sure that I can give it as clearly as I did in the Lost Treasures postscript. So there's a good, long Lost Treasures postscript in the new Lost Treasures postscript edition of Haunted Mesa. Basically, a lot of it was Dad was working at the Catherine mine in the late 1920s, and he and a couple of other miners were laid off, and he went with one of them across Arizona and up into southwestern Colorado to the Durango area, where they worked on some claims that other miner had for a couple of weeks. But on the way, they drove through the Monument Valley area, and that's when he was kind of first exposed to that environment, and I think was impressed by the fact that it was spectacular and spooky and all kinds of things of that sort. And that was probably the inspiration for it. Let me see if I can scan for some more here. Did your dad ever talk about his days in the tank destroyers in World War II? So Dad did not serve in combat in the tank destroyers. He trained, went through officers candidate school as a tank destroyer officer, and did all of his training with them, which was terrific because they were kind of an elite unit, and they got a lot of ammunition to shoot up, and they got a lot of excellent training in various other ways. But when he got his commission, he had just turned 34, and there was a rule that you couldn't begin operations in a combat unit if you were like a frontline unit, if you were over 34. And so he turned 34, and they immediately kind of moved him out of the tank destroyers and handed him off to a transportation corps group. And then he very quickly did a number of jobs in various places all around the country. And then they stuck him it was kind of fascinating. They stuck him on a train that made a huge loop around the US, like from the Pacific Northwest all the way down through Southern California, all the way across the South, and then up the East Coast to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And nobody knew what was going on, but it was collecting officers and they just pulled, every lieutenant and second lieutenant they could find that was loose from their unit and stuck them on this train, along with a number of other people, and they dumped them off in Fort Dix and shipped them over to Europe. And basically, what was going on was D-Day was about to happen, and so Dad, one of the kind of strange and interesting jobs that Dad had was for a couple of weeks he was organizing what went on what ships during the invasion. So he worked the week before the invasion, and he worked the week of the invasion as one of the officers that controlled the logistics of putting whatever they put on the ships. And then he was given he was put into a company of gasoline tankers, and he was hauling aviation fuel and tank fuel all over Europe. Yeah, all over Europe. So he did not serve in combat in the tank destroyers, but he had the wonderful opportunity of training with them. Let's see what else is here. Tim Nett says, Mrs. L'Amour, in case you missed it, what was it like working on the set of Gunsmoke? Why do you think he never wrote for it? They would have had to have asked my dad to write for it, which they didn't do. But what was it like working on the set of Gunsmoke?
It was terrific working on the set of Gunsmoke. It was a new I was on the set of Gunsmoke. So yeah. It was a new show, a Western. It had some really good people attached to it. And it was the kind of a serious take on the West. It wasn't quite the clownish kind of show that you got mostly. And Jim Arness and Amanda and trying to think of the people. Dennis Weaver was on it. And I forget the man who played Doc. But anyway, I had a nice part of like a guest leading role. And I was very excited to be on it. And Charles Marquis Warren, who was a writer, and maybe he wrote ours, was also the director. And it was very exciting for me because I had been working as an actress in little small parts. Forget a good part like that. It was great.
Was that before you met Dad?
No, I had met him.
Uh-huh.
But
were you guys engaged yet?
No, I don't think we were engaged yet. Okay. I can't remember, Bob.
Yeah, so it was fairly early on.
Yeah.
Let's see what else we've got here. Okay, let's see. David O'Callaghan says, since your dad's passing, you have put in some books that you are looking for people. Oh, right. I've put into some of the books that I'm looking for people who knew Dad. Did you get many answering that plea? Yes, I got. I probably got a couple thousand letters, maybe 1,500, maybe 2,000 letters, and out of those 2,000, about 300 of them were really legitimate people who were really trying to help and thought they knew something that I needed to know. And then out of that, maybe about 30 of them were just gold. So that's actually a really good. That's a really good percentage. Whatever percentage it is, if you can put something out into the world and you're just praying that someone somewhere sees it, and you get some stuff that
a lot of response.
Truly, I mean, not only was there a lot of response, but I got a bunch of stuff that truly helped. So yeah, it was extremely useful. And let's see what else we've got here. Somebody wrote in here that Jack London lived until 1916, so he lived until Dad was 8. And did Louis L'Amour have admiration for any other Western authors that wrote exceptionally well? Maybe Zane Grey. What do you think?
Oh, I think he had admiration for a lot of other authors. I'm trying to think of their names. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I'm sorry. I haven't got it at my fingertips. But I know I'd say the names wrong. I don't want to mislead anybody, but there were quite a few writers that he was very, very proud to be in their company, and I think it went both ways.
I think Zane Grey's career was also mostly, was over by the time Louis started writing. Um, and but Dad very briefly worked for Zane Grey, although he never met him. So Zane Grey had a large fishing boat in San Pedro.
Right.
Okay, now, and this is a little hard to imagine. I mean, you call it a fishing boat, but it was a, it was like a three-masted uh, bark. I mean, it was a sailing ship,
Oh yeah,
and
he was a great fisherman.
yeah, he was a great fisherman, and this was in the 1920s, and I'm sure it was a power auxiliary boat, but it was mostly a sailing ship. I mean, and it was big. It was 100 feet, maybe close to 100 feet long, and it was called the Fisherman or the Fisherman Two. He had two boats, and I forget which one was in which era. And Dad and another guy were out of work in San Pedro, and they, from some guy that was like the manager of Zane Grey's ship for Zane Grey, they got the opportunity to come in and re-rig it. So on a sailing ship,
Yeah,
all
I
of the
remember.
lines and cables, basically
Uh-huh.
all the rope on the ship, takes a terrible beating, not only from the weather, but from the incredible strain that the wind puts on the masts and things like that. And you have to change out all of the rigging occasionally because it loses its elasticity. And they didn't really know how to do this, but they went and got a couple of books and kind of were very attentive to what they were taking off the ship and sort of just copied it and put it back on. And so anyway, Dad worked for Zane Grey, and then he was also hired to write the last four Hopalong Cassidy books. And Clarence Mulford, who was the creator of Hopalong Cassidy, um, and Dad had read Hopalong Cassidy books throughout his youth. Um, Clarence Mulford, approved Dad's being hired to do that, so that was a very nice. And Will
Henry.
Henry was a Western writer
Okay.
that was a pretty good.
Yes. Yeah, oh yeah, very
Dad
supportive.
were friendly, and I don't know that Dad and Elmore Leonard knew one another, but Dad really liked Elmore Leonard's work, and
Yeah.
Elmore Leonard wrote some great westerns.
Yeah.
Um, and so Benjamin Talbot says, Kathy, what made you fall in love with Louis? Don't get, you got to be specific. You have to
What made
actually,
me fall in love
yeah.
with her? Well, I think in the beginning, I was very young. And I think in the beginning, I just found him so fascinating. I'd never known anybody who'd been and done all the things Louis had. He'd been around the world. He'd been to China. He'd been to South America. He'd been to Europe. He'd done a lot. And he'd been in the service. And he'd had a writing career of short stories that was pretty successful as long as he wrote a lot of them.
So anybody who traveled around a lot and had been in the service and had written a bunch of short stories, this is somebody that you would have fallen in love with?
No, I
Okay.
fell in love with him because he was sweet, because he was considerate, because he was the most interesting man I ever knew, because he was the most caring person I ever knew, because he was the perfect example of the power of the mind and what he had done and how he had made his life. Coming as a poor boy with a 10th grade, halfway through the 10th grade, the best educated man I've ever met. And that stands true even today. Uh, he was intellectually stimulating. I don't think I could have been happy with anyone who wasn't. He was a romantic. He loved the theater. He loved the ballet. He loved music. He loved restaurants. He loved beautiful clothes. He loved the out of doors. He loved to hike. I mean, he was everything. He was everything a man could ever be. And he was in love with me. And I just fell head over heels. I couldn't help it. I didn't want to get married for quite a while. He kept asking.
And you also have to recognize
But
that they knew one another as friends.
before,
Yeah,
long
that they
before,
saw intermittently. I mean,
yeah,
they weren't together every month, but they saw one another intermittently for
yeah, for a
a
couple of
year,
years.
18 months, maybe two
Yeah,
years.
yeah, I had
Um,
plenty of time to get to know him,
yeah,
and
in kind of a casual way.
in a very casual way, and to become uh, enamored with his personality, and he just instilled great confidence in you. If Louis was there, you knew everything was going to be okay, um, and he was positive. I mean, he was perfect, Beau. Whatever you think, your dad was perfect.
All right. Let's see here. Jeff Blackman is asking. I've read some of the short stories that your dad wrote about himself. Oops, the thing just jumped again and I lost it. So that's irritating. I will get back to you. I'm sorry. The feed just sort of jumps around and um, I lost your comment, which is really irritating. Um, okay, I'm pressing on. It is 7 o'clock and we're going to wrap up pretty soon, so I'm going to zip to the end and just look at what the last couple of questions are. Except I have to find questions. Let's see here. Did Louis approve of the movie version of Shalako with Sean Connery?
Yes, I think he
Yeah,
did. Oh, definitely,
yeah.
absolutely.
You have to understand that Dad had a very close relationship with the producer of that film, and they did some things, Louis and Ewan, who was the producer, that were kind of astounding. The way they pulled that film together was really really amazing. Again, I'm going to tout the Lost Treasures postscript to it because if I went into it, it would be in all kinds of Hollywood geeky detail, and it would take forever.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting. And personally, I don't think the film turned out all that good. But if you know, if somebody told you that in 1968 somebody made a Louis L'Amour Western movie with Sean Connery and Bridget Bardot, I mean, come on, that would be like, I have to see this. Are you kidding me? Um, it was a great opportunity. Um, and so see if there's a couple more. Vince Bowman says, "Who is passing through?" See, I keep getting this is such a wonderful opportunity to keep plugging Lost Treasures because there is a Lost Treasures, or hopefully, I'm not sure that it's published yet, but there will be a Lost Treasures postscript to Passing Through, and a lot of people want to know if that's someone they know, and the answer really truly is, I'm going to scoop myself a little bit. No, it's not. However, you're right that maybe you think you knew who that character was because Louis started writing that story thinking he was going to write it as a Sackett story, and he changed. And I think he realized at that moment that he had a plan for what he wanted all the Sackett stories to be, sort of he wanted them to cover, and he didn't want to just create a couple of generic Sackett westerns that didn't really fit into the plan, and so he sort of changed. But there is a tone of a Sackett story in Passing Through, and a lot of people notice that, and so that's probably a good call. And so last question for the moment, although like I said, I'll come back in this and try and answer some more. Except the thing has stalled. Someone said, "How did Louis propose?" So that'll be the last question.
Oh
So
my.
so how did Louis propose?
Okay. Well, let's see. Louis started proposing marriage long before I accepted. I was going to be an actress. I was an actress, and I was not interested in getting married. It wasn't that I didn't love him, but I just wasn't interested in getting married. And he kept after me and kept after me. And one day he called me and he said, if you're not going to marry me, I'm going to close up my apartment and I'm going to move to New York. I want to write for the theater. And I said, oh, I said, that's great. Good luck to you. And I wished him luck, and I hung up. And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, I can't be in this world without this man. I just can't live without this man. And I called him back and I said, yes, yes, yes. So that was it. I guess the formal proposal with the ring was in the Brown Derby on Vine Street in Hollywood. We had a little corner table that he liked to sit at, and we were in there for an early bite one night, and he had the ring in his pocket. And that's when he really popped the question. But I knew then that it was, and he knew then that the answer was yes. So that phone call was probably the smartest move I ever made in my life. Thank heaven I didn't blow it.
All right, so we're going to end there. And if you check back into the feed, I will hopefully answer some more questions if I find some things that need answering. So thank you all, and have a good night. And thanks for reading and being there. And hopefully we've alleviated some people's boredom and things of that sort. So take care, and have a good evening.
Good evening.